When I told my family I bought a company, they laughed. My dad smirked and said, "With what dollars?" My brother snorted. My Aunt Cheryl almost choked on her drink. I didn't argue. I just invited them to a business dinner the following week. They showed up and saw me at the head table, right next to the CEO. Then he stood up, looked at the room, and said, "Let me introduce our new owner." Their faces? Absolutely frozen. Even my dad couldn't speak. My name is Aria Miles, and for most of my life I've been underestimated by the people who were supposed to know me best. I didn't grow up in a bad household. We weren't rich, but we were stable. My dad, Martin, worked construction for over 25 years. He believed in showing up early, doing what you're told, and not dreaming beyond your paycheck. My mom, Dana, was softer but passive. She worked part-time at a bakery and never challenged my dad's opinions. If he said something was unrealistic, that was the end of it. My older brother Luke followed closely in his footsteps. He worked in auto sales and acted like he was the unofficial boss of the family, always quick with a joke or a dismissive comment if anyone stepped out of line, especially me. Since I was young, I knew I thought differently. I liked ideas, not just abstract ones, but real-world problems and creative solutions. While my family spent evenings watching game shows or flipping through sports highlights, I was curled up with books on business strategy, behavioral economics, and startup culture. I didn't tell people about it. I just studied, listened, watched, took notes in silence. That silence became my superpower. I knew early on that talking wouldn't get me anywhere in that house. My dad believed hard work meant using your hands. He didn't respect laptops, internet jobs, or anything that didn't involve sweat. So when I got into digital marketing, he didn't ask a single question, just said, "Hope you've got a backup plan." My brother liked to tease me too. If I ever mentioned work, he'd chuckle and say, "Oh yeah, Aria's building empires from her bedroom." They didn't know I was actually doing just that. After college, I worked 3 jobs. I freelanced for startups, ran social media accounts, and helped brands build their customer base from scratch. Every dollar I made that didn't go toward rent or food went into investments. I learned how to flip undervalued digital assets, bought into early software products, and reinvested every return. I didn't party. I didn't buy new clothes unless I needed to. I lived below my means and watched everyone else count me out. What they didn't see were the late nights I spent poring over cash flow statements, teaching myself how to read term sheets, and studying company structure. I wasn't just freelancing. I was building my own education, brick by brick. I didn't go to business school. I made my own. The company I eventually bought had been on my radar for almost 2 years. It was a mid-sized tech firm in a niche B2B space. Good product, loyal client base, but poor leadership and stalled vision. I followed their progress quietly, read their annual reports, monitored their client retention trends, and even subscribed to their software just to experience it from the inside. By the time the opportunity came to acquire a controlling stake, I was ready. I had the capital, the connections, and the confidence, but I also had years of being told I couldn't do something, echoing in the back of my mind. So when the deal finally closed, and I sat with the signed paperwork in front of me, I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just exhaled, because I knew the real test wasn't getting there. It was showing up to my family, the ones who had doubted me from the start, and letting them see what I had actually done. A few days later, we had dinner at my parents' house, just a regular Sunday meal. Everyone was there. My parents, Luke, Aunt Cheryl. The food was warm, the conversation light. Then someone asked what I'd been up to lately. I told them I bought a company. It was instant. My dad laughed out loud and said, "With what dollars?" Like it was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. My brother smirked and said, "Sure you did." My mom gave me a weak smile. Aunt Cheryl muttered something like, "Well, look at little Miss CEO over here." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked around the table, took one sip of water, and said, "There's a business dinner this Thursday. You're all invited." I slid an envelope across the table with the event details. They looked confused, curious maybe, but mostly amused. I could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought I was bluffing, pretending, putting on a show. What they didn't know was that the curtain had already lifted. The show was real, and they were about to sit front row. The days leading up to the dinner felt surreal, not because I was nervous about the event itself, but because I knew what it would mean. This wasn't just a business dinner. It was the first time in my life that I would get to sit in a room as the person I had worked so hard to become. Not the version my family still believed I was. I didn't need them to be impressed. I didn't even need them to apologize for the years of eye rolls and sarcasm. What I needed, what I truly wanted, was for them to see the truth with their own eyes. I was tired of feeling invisible in my own story. I had earned this moment, and I wasn't going to let their disbelief steal it from me. I spent those days focusing on logistics. I confirmed the guest list with the company's executive assistant. I reviewed the seating chart to make sure my family wouldn't be lost in the back of the room. I ordered place cards for each of them, printed with their names in bold, professional font. I even made sure the CEO's speech would mention me directly, not because I needed the spotlight, but because I knew they needed to hear it from someone with authority. But even as I prepared, I could feel the tension building. At home, the group chat was silent. No one asked what the event was really about. My dad didn't text for clarification. My brother didn't crack any more jokes. It was as if they were ignoring the invitation altogether, hoping it would go away. The more silent they were, the more I knew they were talking about it behind my back. Then, the morning of the dinner, my mom called. "Do we need to wear anything specific?" she asked, sounding hesitant. "It's a formal business event," I said. "Cocktail attire is fine." She paused. "Is this for your job?" "It's for the company I own," I replied. Another pause. Right. That single word, packed with doubt, told me everything. She didn't believe me. Maybe she wanted to, but she didn't. Later that afternoon, my brother Luke messaged me. "Is this thing legit, or are we about to get roped into a timeshare pitch?" I didn't reply. I arrived at the venue early, as I always do. The ballroom was being set for over 100 guests. It was polished and professional, floor-length linens, softly glowing chandeliers, a perfectly centered podium on a small stage. My place at the head table was clearly marked. My title was listed beneath my name, Majority Owner, Apex Core Solutions. As I sat down, one of the board members leaned over and said, "You handled this entire transition with precision, Arya. People twice your age couldn't have pulled it off." I thanked him calmly, but inside, I wished my father had heard it. At exactly 6:45, I saw them walk in. My dad was in a wrinkled blazer and dress shoes he hadn't worn in years. My mom clutched a small purse and kept looking around, visibly overwhelmed. Luke wore a button-up and jeans, still trying to act casual, and Aunt Cheryl had that half-smirk plastered on her face, like she was waiting for the punchline. They walked past company logos, a photo board of our executive team, and dozens of employees shaking hands and networking. They looked confused. My dad glanced at the table assignments, his eyes scanning for our last name. Then they saw me. I was seated at the head table, mid-conversation with Thomas Becker, the CEO I now employed. My nameplate was in front of me. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I simply met their eyes and returned to the conversation. They were escorted to their seats. I watched them sink into their chairs, heads turning slowly, the realization slowly settling across their faces. This wasn't a networking event. This wasn't a seminar. This was my company's formal transition dinner. I wasn't a guest. I was the reason everyone was there. I could feel the tension burning between us, even from across the room. For the first time in years, they were silent, not out of politeness, but out of disbelief. The roles had reversed, and they were no longer the ones holding the power in the conversation. They had no control, no jokes, no clever dismissals, just silence. And for the first time, I wasn't shrinking in my seat. I wasn't looking for validation. I was exactly where I was meant to be. The moment wasn't even at its peak yet, but the conflict had already begun to crack open. Everything they thought they knew about me was unraveling, and they didn't know what to do with it. I did. I waited, because the best part was still coming. As the dinner began, I stayed composed. I knew this was the moment where I could either shrink or stand fully in my power. For most of my life, I had watched myself fade into the background at family gatherings, letting their opinions shape the narrative of who I was. But this dinner was different. I had earned this seat. I had built something real. And now, the truth was sitting in plain sight for them to witness, not through my words, but through undeniable reality. Servers moved around the room, setting plated meals and pouring drinks. The chatter grew louder, but at our head table, there was a focused calm. I was surrounded by executives, team leaders, and advisors, people who respected me not because of my name, but because of what I brought to the table. For once, I wasn't hoping to prove anything. I had already done the work. The only decision left was how I wanted to carry myself through what was about to happen. The agenda was printed clearly on each table. After the welcome speech, there would be a brief company update, followed by an official acknowledgement of new ownership. That was my moment. It wasn't about performance, it was about presence. I would stand, I would speak, and I would let my family sit in the truth they had once laughed off. I glanced over at them. My dad sat stiffly, arms crossed, eyes roaming the room like he was still trying to make sense of it all. My mom looked unsure, torn between pride and confusion. Luke was scrolling through his phone, but he wasn't really looking at it, and Aunt Cheryl just looked uncomfortable, her smile now replaced with a puzzled frown. I took a slow breath and reminded myself, I didn't bring them here to be impressed. I brought them here to watch. The welcome speech began. Thomas Becker, the outgoing CEO, stood with grace and authority. He thanked the guests, acknowledged the hard-working team, and spoke with warmth about the company's future. Then came the transition segment. He stepped aside, looked directly at me, and said into the microphone, "Before we move forward with the next phase of Apex Core, I'd like to introduce someone who needs no introduction to our leadership team, but deserves one tonight. She is the reason we're here, the one who saw value in us when others didn't. Please join me in welcoming our new majority owner, Aria Miles." He extended his hand toward me as the entire room turned in my direction. I stood. There was a moment of stillness, like the air had shifted. Applause broke out, first in scattered claps, then in full waves. People at the other tables began standing. The respect in that room wasn't polite, it was earned, and the moment it happened, I didn't look at the crowd first. I looked at my dad. His face was unreadable. Not angry, not proud, just stunned. The man who once laughed when I said I'd run something of my own was now watching an entire room honor me for doing exactly that. I stepped forward and walked to the podium. I didn't give a long speech, just a few words. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you all for being here. This company represents years of effort, not just mine, but yours. What we're building together is only possible because of every one of you in this room. I'm proud to be a part of it, and I'm even prouder of where we're going next. Simple. Director, clear. The room clapped again, and I returned to my seat. From across the ballroom, I caught my brother looking at me. His face had changed. No more smirks, no more jokes, just something quieter. He looked away quickly, but the silence around their table spoke louder than anything. That was the turning point. Not the dinner, not the title, but that one moment when I stood up and no one could deny it anymore. I wasn't trying to change their minds. I wasn't demanding respect. I was just doing what I had always done, showing up fully, doing the work, and letting the results speak louder than the noise. After I sat down, someone at our table leaned in and said, "That was the shortest, strongest speech I've heard from a new owner." I smiled, because that's exactly what I wanted it to be. As I sat back down, the applause still fading behind me, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. Not triumph, not vengeance, not even pride, really. Just a quiet, steady peace that came from knowing I no longer needed to explain myself to anyone. I had spoken, I had led, and now, the people who had spent years doubting me were sitting in silence, trying to process everything they had just witnessed. After the speeches, dinner continued, and the mood in the room shifted to something more relaxed. Guests mingled, team members toasted to the new leadership, and conversations buzzed around goals, product ideas, and upcoming campaigns. But my family remained seated, unusually quiet, plates mostly untouched. They weren't chatting, they weren't asking questions, they were absorbing. Eventually, Thomas Becker, the outgoing CEO, made his way to their table. I hadn't planned it, he didn't know the full backstory, but Thomas was observant, and something in the energy of that table must have caught his attention. He walked up with his usual calm demeanor and extended his hand to my father. "Martin, right?" he said. "I'm Thomas Becker. I've had the pleasure of working alongside your daughter these past few months." My dad slowly stood and shook his hand stiffly. "Yes, nice to meet you." Thomas looked at each of them and said, "I've been in this business for over 30 years. I've seen all types of leadership, loud, messy, flashy, but Aria, she's one of the sharpest minds I've met. Quiet, focused, absolutely prepared. The kind of owner who doesn't just lead a company, she transforms it. You should be very proud." He turned to walk away, but paused for just a second. Then he added, "She didn't inherit this. She built it, every part of it." And then he walked off. That was the moment. The real climax wasn't in the speech or the announcement. It was in those words. That calm, direct statement from someone with no reason to lie, no emotional ties, and no agenda. Just the truth. I looked over at my dad, whose shoulders seemed to sink just a little. He sat down slowly, his hands folded tightly in front of him. He didn't look at anyone. For once, he had nothing to say. Not because he was angry, but because there were no more excuses, no more jokes to cover the discomfort, no more assumptions to lean on. He had heard it from someone else, a man of status, someone he would have respected immediately under any other circumstance, and that made it real in a way my words never had. My mom glanced at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between awe and guilt. Luke sat still, staring at his glass of water like it held answers. Even Aunt Cheryl was quiet, her usual snark completely gone. It wasn't just that they had misjudged me, it was that they had never even tried to see me. For years, they had assigned me a role in their heads. Naive, artsy, the one with big ideas but no plan. And now, all of that had been stripped away in under an hour. And the best part? I didn't have to say a thing. I didn't need to defend, prove, or perform. My work had done all of that for me. The truth had stood on its own, in a room full of strangers and professionals who already knew what my family had refused to believe for years. When the event ended and guests began to leave, I made my way toward their table. I wasn't sure what I'd say, or if I'd say anything at all, but as I approached, my dad stood up and looked at me. For a moment, I thought he was going to speak, maybe apologize, maybe acknowledge what had just happened, but he didn't. He just looked at me for a long, silent second, then nodded. A slow, tight nod. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. But for him, it meant everything. And I nodded back, because that was enough. He didn't have the words. He probably never would. But in that quiet exchange, I saw something shift. Maybe not completely, maybe not forever, but enough to know that he finally saw me not as the daughter with silly ideas, but as the woman who built something real, on her own terms. And for once, that silence didn't hurt. It satisfied. The weeks that followed that dinner were quiet, at least from my family. No dramatic phone calls, no sudden outpouring of support, no apologies. And strangely, I didn't feel disappointed by that. I wasn't waiting for a redemption arc. I wasn't hoping they'd rewrite the past or suddenly act like they'd believed in me all along. What I had wanted most that night wasn't validation. It was clarity. And now that I had it, I felt lighter. I kept moving forward. My focus shifted back to the company, building out leadership teams, refining operations, and aligning the vision with what I always knew it could become. The difference was, I was doing it with a new sense of calm. I no longer felt the need to prove myself to anyone. That invisible pressure, the one I had carried since I was a teenager, trying to be taken seriously in my own family, had finally lifted. One afternoon, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off a package for my mom. She had messaged me earlier in the week, asking if I still had the chocolate supplier I'd once recommended. It was a small thing, but I noticed the shift. There was no trace of sarcasm in her tone, just a quiet request, like she was feeling her way toward a new kind of relationship with me. She opened the door and smiled, genuinely. "Thank you," she said, taking the box. "That was really thoughtful of you." We stood there for a second. Then she added, "I've been reading more about your company, the stuff you do. I had no idea it was that big." I nodded. "It's growing. I'm proud of you, Aria," she said carefully, like the words were unfamiliar in her mouth but real nonetheless. "Thanks, Mom," I said, and I meant it. I didn't need more. My dad was in the backyard, working on the fence. I saw him glance up as I left, then nod, just like he had at the dinner. That was all he gave me, a nod. But somehow, I understood it better now. For him, it was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get, and maybe that was enough. He wasn't the kind of man who would say the words out loud, but that nod came from a different place than it used to. Not mockery, not dismissal, just quiet respect. I've learned a lot through this journey, but the most important thing has been this. Not everyone is going to see you clearly. Even the people who raised you, who claim to know you best, might hold on to outdated versions of you for longer than you can stand. And that's not your burden to fix. Your job isn't to argue or convince. Your job is to keep building, keep showing up, and let your actions speak where your words have always been ignored. Owning a company wasn't about status for me. It was about independence, about having the freedom to shape something that mattered, about doing meaningful work without waiting for someone else's permission. And now, when I walk into my office and see a team that trusts my leadership, I no longer carry the weight of that old self-doubt. I've outgrown it. People ask me all the time what I'd say to someone who feels overlooked or underestimated by their family. My answer is simple. Stop handing them the pen. Don't let anyone else write your story for you, especially not the people who can't see the size of your ambition. Write it yourself, quietly, relentlessly, and with conviction. And one day, they'll read it out loud in rooms they never thought you'd walk into. That dinner didn't change who I was. It simply revealed it, to them, and maybe even to me. So no, I didn't get the fairy tale ending with hugs and proud tears and photo albums, but I got something better. I got to sit at the head of a table I built myself, with my name on the agenda and my vision in motion. And when I looked around the room that night, I realized I didn't just prove them wrong, I proved myself right.